In the chamber of the oldest civilizations, silence hung like a weight heavier than gravity. The assembled leaders carried centuries of experience, yet even among species that had survived stellar cataclysms and internal wars, a shared unease clouded their eyes. They gathered not to debate commerce, territory, or science, but to deliver a judgment none dared to speak lightly. At the center, carved into stone older than some stars, was the decree being etched with deliberate care: humans must never be allowed to go to war. The words were not spoken as advice, nor as suggestion, but as law born of fear. No other declaration had carried such finality. The reasoning was not rooted in technological disparity. Many empires outstripped humanity in weapons, fleets, and machines of destruction. The terror came instead from something older, something that could not be quantified by energy yields or fleet sizes. It came from a will buried deep in human instinct, a drive to survive and to dominate, a refusal to accept extinction even when cornered. Other species had fought wars to expand or to protect, but humans fought as if war itself was life, as if to lose was to cease existing entirely. That perception made them dangerous beyond measure. The archives held records that none outside the council chambers were permitted to see. They depicted a species only recently joined to the interstellar community, but one whose own history was littered with self-inflicted scars. On a single planet, with no external enemies, they had annihilated each other with fire, steel, and weapons capable of blotting out entire cities. They had done so not once, but repeatedly, in cycles of destruction followed by desperate rebuilding. They did not stop at the brink of annihilation, they only paused, rebuilt stronger, and prepared for the next struggle. It was this pattern that convinced the galaxy's most ancient minds that if given the stage of the stars, the same behavior would multiply outward with catastrophic results. When the decree was first whispered, many counselors resisted. Some claimed it was an insult to declare a single species so uniquely dangerous. Others argued that perhaps humanity could be guided, mentored, brought into the fold of peace that other civilizations had managed to preserve. But opposition faltered as evidence mounted. The first exploratory clashes between human vessels and opportunistic raiders showed something unsettling. Where most younger species retreated when outnumbered, humans advanced. Where casualties should have broken morale, humans pressed harder, improvising tactics no machine predicted. The recorded transmissions chilled the blood of even hardened warriors, humans laughing in the face of death, promising vengeance while bleeding, fighting with broken ships until only wreckage remained around them. The elders agreed that such defiance, once multiplied by the resources of a growing interstellar presence, could not be contained. If humans ever fought a true war with all their numbers and creativity unleashed, there would be no equilibrium afterward. They would not simply conquer, they would destroy until no rival remained standing. Entire empires might be swept away not through superior firepower, but through persistence that eroded every resistance. That vision of endless struggle haunted the collective imagination of the council. Thus the words were carved: never allow humans to go to war. Not because humanity was inherently evil, but because their potential for devastation was unmatched. The galaxy had known conquerors, tyrants, and genocidal crusades before, but humans embodied all of these possibilities while carrying an unmatched resilience. A human war would not end neatly with treaties. It would grind on until enemies were broken beyond recovery. That was what every elder feared: the war that did not stop, the fire that did not burn out. The council's decree became more than legislation, it became doctrine. Every ambassador memorized the phrase, every strategist warned their leaders of its implications. The words spread in whispers to outlying colonies: beware the Terrans. Do not provoke them. Do not corner them. Do not let them awaken the part of their history written in blood. For if they did, the galaxy itself might shatter under the weight of their fury. By the end of the assembly, silence once again dominated the chamber. Not a single delegate dared to question the outcome. They had seen enough, studied enough, and feared enough to know one truth: the greatest weapon humanity possessed was not a fleet, not a missile, not even their science. It was the human refusal to surrender. Against that, no empire could endure for long. And so the law stood unchallenged: etched into eternity as both warning and plea: never allow humans to go to war. The archives were never meant to be opened by untrained eyes. They were buried beneath layers of encryption, guarded by oaths and ancient wards, consulted only when the council required reminders of why their decree existed. Within those records lay not conjecture, but first-hand accounts of encounters between humans and the wider galaxy. They were rare, for humanity's interstellar age was young, but each incident carried weight far greater than its scale. Every skirmish, every confrontation, every survival story became a case study in why the species could not be allowed to engage in war on a larger front. The first files described an ambush along the edge of colonized space. A group of raiders, seasoned in preying upon fledgling civilizations, intercepted a convoy of human settlers. The attackers expected panic, surrender, or futile resistance. Instead, what they recorded was something they had never encountered. The human crews fought with a precision that belied their inexperience, turning mining equipment into weapons, ramming smaller craft with suicidal efficiency, refusing to abandon their civilians even as losses mounted. When the raiders finally retreated, they left behind a warning: these were not prey. They were predators wearing the mask of pioneers. The words, scribbled in a dying captain's last transmission, were preserved as evidence of a truth that would haunt those who read it. Another record told of a single outpost that endured a siege lasting months. The attackers were technologically superior, equipped with energy weapons capable of erasing defenses in minutes. By every model, the colony should have fallen within days. Yet humans adapted. They turned wreckage into fortifications, stripped their own vessels for parts, and waged a campaign of attrition that baffled their enemies. Outnumbered and undersupplied, they still countered every advance with traps and ambushes. Even when food supplies dwindled, they shared the last rations equally among soldiers and children alike. The final report from the aggressors stated, with a tone of disbelief, that the humans fought harder when starvation began to claim them. For the Council, it was confirmation that desperation only sharpened their resolve. The archives expanded with testimonies from scouts who had tested Terran borders. They spoke of unpredictability. Where most species followed doctrine and rigid patterns, humans shifted strategy constantly, never fighting the same way twice. One encounter saw a human vessel disable an enemy frigate by venting atmosphere in a calculated burst, freezing attackers mid-charge. Another involved the use of decoys made from hollowed cargo containers, drawing enemy fire long enough for human crews to strike with weapons jury-rigged from industrial lasers. To the Council, such ingenuity was not cleverness, it was evidence of a mind shaped for conflict, willing to twist any tool into an instrument of survival. Most chilling of all were the behavioral analyses. Psychologists from several worlds studied the human response to mortality. Instead of collapsing into despair, humans seemed to grow more dangerous when confronted with death. The files spoke of soldiers who dragged broken bodies to cover while still firing, of pilots steering crippled ships into enemy formations rather than ejecting, of civilians who fought alongside soldiers, as if every life carried equal weight in defense of their species. The analysts concluded that humans possessed no natural threshold for surrender. Other species reached a point where survival instinct turned to self-preservation, where retreat became logical. Humans bypassed that stage. They fought until they had either secured victory or been entirely annihilated. The Council elders read these records with heavy hearts. They did not interpret them as heroism or nobility, though such qualities were present. Instead, they saw a pattern of escalation that no containment strategy could withstand. If small encounters with limited resources produced such results, then what would happen if humanity mobilized on a galactic scale? If a people capable of such resilience with bare hands and improvised weapons were granted fleets and arsenals equal to the great powers, what force in existence could stand against them? Thus the archives were sealed, not to be forgotten but to be preserved as proof. They became the foundation for the decree, the silent testimony of those who had learned firsthand that humans were not to be measured by the sum of their technology, but by the ferocity of their will. In those encrypted halls, the galaxy stored its deepest fear, that the next entry would no longer describe a skirmish or an outpost, but a war that consumed entire civilizations. And so the records remained hidden, a warning whispered in stone: never allow humans to go to war. When humanity was summoned to stand before the galaxy's ruling assembly, it was not with chains or with triumphal banners but with wary distance. The chamber that had echoed with decrees and fears now prepared to address the very subject of its most recent law. Delegates leaned forward with unease as the human envoy stepped into the center, a figure unarmed yet heavier than armies in the minds of those who watched. The elders spoke first, voices trembling despite their ceremonial calm, declaring that humanity must be restrained, that the very survival of countless worlds required they be denied the right to wage war. They cited the archives, the testimonies, the records of defiance that no other race could match. Their decree was not negotiable, they insisted, but a shield for all life. The human representative did not bow. They listened in silence, letting accusations and proclamations spill across the chamber like a storm. When the final word fell, the envoy's reply was measured, stripped of theatrics. They asked why humanity was condemned for what it might become, while empires with centuries of conquests behind them still sat in judgment. The envoy recounted histories not hidden but ignored, species that had raised weaker neighbors to ash, fleets that had enslaved entire populations, civilizations that had carved borders with blood. Those aggressions were forgiven as relics of the past. Yet humanity, still new among the stars, was branded too dangerous even to be given the choice. A murmur swept through the chamber. Some counselors bristled, others averted their eyes. The envoy continued, pointing out that humanity's greatest crime so far was survival against aggression, not instigation of it. They had defended colonies, resisted raiders, endured sieges, but had not sought expansion through extermination. The question lingered in the air: was humanity feared for its deeds, or for the fear that lived in the imaginations of others? The envoy's voice carried no rage, only iron certainty, as they stated that fear was not justice, and paranoia was not peace. Responses rippled from every corner of the assembly. Some species hissed warnings, reminding all that humans laughed in the face of death, that they fought with reckless abandon, that no logic restrained them in the heat of combat. Others, quieter but no less firm, admitted that the envoy's words struck true, that hypocrisy reeked within the council's decree. The chamber split, not by alliances or species, but by instinct, those who believed control was safety, and those who believed fear could never replace fairness. The elders attempted to reassert control, declaring that their decision was final, that the preservation of civilization outweighed the pride of one species. But the envoy answered with a single truth that chilled the room: denying humanity the right to fight did not erase its nature. If the galaxy forced them into a corner, humans would not ask permission to survive. They would act as they always had, with a determination that cared little for decrees. This was not a threat but a warning, a recognition of what history had already shown. For the first time, the chamber felt the presence of humanity not as rumor, not as archive, but as living defiance. The envoy's composure carried the weight of a truth older than stars, that humans would never beg for existence. They would endure, adapt, and if pushed, unleash the part of themselves the galaxy most feared. The council had hoped to contain that fire with laws and words, but instead they had lit a spark of resentment. That day, in the hall built to embody galactic unity, the reality became clear: humanity would never be caged by fear, and if the council sought to bind them, the decree might one day become the prophecy that summoned its own ruin. The decree was meant to end the matter, yet history does not bend to words alone. At the distant edge of human space, where oversight was weakest and ambition strongest, a border empire sought to test the limits of the council's authority. They viewed humanity as an upstart species unworthy of the respect shown to ancient powers. A single colony became the target of their arrogance, chosen not for strategic value but to make a statement that humans could be humbled. The first strike fell without warning, tearing through orbital defenses and sending civilians scrambling for shelter. To the attackers, it was a display meant to cow a younger race. To the colonists, it was a violation that demanded endurance. News spread across the council like wildfire. The very scenario they feared had been triggered not by human aggression but by another's miscalculation. Debates erupted immediately. Some argued for swift intervention to suppress the humans before retaliation could escalate. Others insisted restraint was essential, that intervention itself would ignite the confrontation they sought to prevent. The chamber fractured along lines of panic and pride, but while words collided in the capital, the situation at the colony worsened. The attackers expected surrender within days. Instead, they met resistance that defied every prediction. Civilians transformed into defenders overnight, arming themselves with tools and salvaged weapons. Engineers repurposed atmospheric processors into crude cannons. Pilots flew outdated shuttles in reckless sorties, crippling enemy craft through sheer audacity. Every assault met with unexpected losses, eroding the confidence of a force that had believed victory inevitable. The more pressure applied, the harder the colony resisted, as if adversity itself fueled their strength. Reports of these engagements reached the council, and with each transmission came a mounting dread. The words etched in stone were becoming reality. The elders convened in urgency, voices rising in desperation. They feared that if reinforcements arrived from Earth, the conflict would transform from isolated resistance into the very war they had sworn to prevent. Proposals to blockade humanity's homeworld surfaced, alongside suggestions of diplomatic concessions to the aggressors. Yet no consensus formed, for every choice carried the same shadow: provoke humans too far, and they would awaken. Already the colony's defiance was stirring stories, spreading across the stars faster than censorship could suppress. Whispers spoke of ordinary men and women holding the line against fleets, of a species that did not crumble under fire but sharpened with every strike. Among the council, factions grew bolder in opposition. Some claimed the decree had been an error, that treating humanity as a monster had invited this outcome. Others clung tighter to fear, insisting the only path was containment before escalation became unstoppable. Accusations flew, alliances strained, and trust fractured. What was meant to unite the galaxy against a common threat now tore it apart. Meanwhile, on the frontier, the attackers found themselves trapped in a campaign they could not abandon without humiliation. Every failed assault deepened their desperation, pushing them to escalate beyond reason. As the siege dragged on, the inevitability became undeniable. Humanity was not collapsing. They were adapting, enduring, and preparing. The colony, instead of falling, was transforming into a symbol that drew the attention of every watchful world. The Council's law had not prevented war, it had created the very conditions for it. Fear had become prophecy, and prophecy was becoming truth. The moment the first reinforcements departed from Earth, the galaxy understood the decree had failed. The beast they dreaded was stirring, not because it sought conquest, but because survival demanded nothing less. The siege did not end in silence but in revelation. As the attackers faltered, and as the Council hesitated, humanity answered not with retreat but with a message that spread across every channel, piercing through interference and censorship alike. It was not a declaration of conquest, nor a boast of superiority. It was a statement of identity, spoken with clarity and weight. They did not claim perfection. They admitted their history, their scars, their flaws carved by centuries of self-inflicted conflict. Yet they also declared an unshakable truth: when forced to fight, humanity did not stop halfway. They carried struggle to its absolute conclusion, and any who demanded war would discover its final cost. The words unsettled those who listened, not because they were threats, but because they rang with an honesty that could not be dismissed. Every empire had declared victory at some point in history, yet few had spoken with such certainty that war, once begun, would never be abandoned. Humanity's leaders explained that survival was not a strategy to them, but instinct, that surrender had never guaranteed safety in their own past, and therefore could never be accepted in the present. They had learned across millennia that the only lasting peace came when their enemies no longer had the power to rise again. This was the truth the Council had feared, now voiced without apology. On the besieged colony, the evidence of that truth was written in ruins still held by human hands. Children carried water to defenders. Farmers guarded barricades as if they had trained for it their entire lives. Engineers repaired weapons with materials meant for harvesters and factories. None of them waited for rescue. They acted as if every breath was one more strike against extinction. The attackers, now reduced to desperation, could not comprehend how people so overmatched continued to resist with greater intensity than when the siege began. It became clear that victory against them was not a matter of force but of erasing the will of an entire species, and such a task was impossible. The council's chambers echoed with disbelief. Their law had been meant to prevent this very demonstration, yet it had unfolded before their eyes. Some elders whispered that perhaps the decree had been wise, for here was the nightmare embodied. Others murmured that perhaps it had been folly, for by treating humanity as inevitable monsters, they had ensured humanity responded as one. The galaxy watched as fear clashed with admiration. Enemies saw danger, allies saw potential, but all saw the same truth: humans would not bow. The envoy who once stood before the chamber spoke again, this time through the same broadcast. They clarified that humanity did not seek endless conflict. Their ambition was not domination, nor empire, nor submission of others. They sought only to live without chains, to build without being burned down, to walk among the stars without being treated as a contagion. But if denied that right, if attacked, if hunted, they would answer in the only way they knew, with persistence until the threat was gone forever. This was not a choice of brutality but of necessity learned from their own history, from a planet where mercy often meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant extinction. The message concluded with a warning etched into memory: war with humanity would never be a campaign or a border dispute. It would be total. It would not end with treaties but with finality. For those who valued peace, the path was simple: do not provoke what could not be contained. The council fell silent as the transmission ended, and in that silence lay recognition of a reality none could deny. The decree carved into stone had not been a safeguard. It had been a confession of fear. Now that fear stood realized, embodied not in weapons, but in voices that refused to yield. From that moment, the law was remembered not as a restriction placed on humanity, but as advice for everyone else. Do not awaken their fury. Do not corner their spirit. For when humans go to war, it is not for conquest or for sport. It is for survival, and survival for them has always meant victory without compromise. The chamber's oldest walls seemed to echo the truth, a truth that would outlast decrees and councils alike. Never allow humans to go to war, not for their sake, but for yours.